Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hello, Fara.
All right. Are we all ready? Ready to talk about climate change? This morning, we have two excellent climate reporters, climate journalists, and it is my pleasure to welcome Priti Salian, who is a Bangalore-based journalist who's reported from India, Germany, and Uganda on development, human rights, and social justice. While she has said that she doesn't consider herself a climate journalist, she's going to take us on a deep dive of a story that she's done that I think really represents the multiple layers that we see in environmental and climate journalism. And we also have Julia Migne, who I'm very happy to introduce as well. She is a science communicator and journalist currently based in Oxford in the UK. She's the co-founder of INKLINE, an international media platform that features solutions-focused news and interviews with organizations that champion cultural causes. Julia also was a lead fellow for Solutions Journalism Network. I'm going to kick it off in just a few minutes, but I wanted to let people know that if they have any, if they want to inquire at all about solutions journalism, I'll be putting some links into the chat box so you can hear more. And we'll also be putting links into the chat for the articles that Priti and Julia will be discussing. So Priti, I'm going to turn it over to you to start the conversation. Take us on your journey of the story that you did.
Thank you, Fara, and thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. The story I'm about to speak on was published by DevX in 2018. Before I get into it, I'd like to introduce the Indian state of Kerala, which is located on the shores of the Arabian Sea and is highly vulnerable to natural disasters such as floods and landslides. Over the years, the scale of impact of these disasters has risen due to various reasons, such as deforestation, rampant illegal stone quarrying, destruction of mangroves, sand mining on the riverbeds, and of course, inappropriate construction in unsafe locations. In August of 2018, Kerala received torrential rains, leading to the most devastating floods and landslides in its 100-year history. The disaster killed nearly 500 people, displaced about 1.5 million, and caused $2.7 billion worth of damages. The story I wrote begins in September, when the state government and humanitarian organizations were fully mobilized and working rapidly on relief measures. My piece is about Kerala's Education Department's initiative to modify the school curriculum to integrate disaster management and its mitigation into textbooks of all subjects. So the state saw at least 3 problems that could be potentially solved with this. One, there's a knowledge gap and ignorance among citizens about the ecological vulnerabilities of the region. During the 2018 floods, some people were overconfident of their ability to deal with the situation. They were unable to sufficiently gauge the risks and were even unwilling to cooperate with rescue teams. I was told that some people even refused to vacate their homes when warned about the flood, thinking that they would be able to tackle the water devils on their own. The second problem was that children living near hill slopes and riverbanks were badly impacted without being forewarned of such a calamity or the ways to deal with it. I spoke to a 10th grade boy, Shamim, who was in his brick and stone home when the landslide hit, and he and his mom had just a few minutes to escape. Of course, the trauma would stay with him for years, but he told me that some information on landslides and probably a few mock drills in schools would have helped him appreciate their impact and also given him the confidence to face this kind of a terrible disaster. The state knew that there were thousands of children like Shamim who were displaced and were under stress and in need of psychosocial care. And the third problem that was seen was that disaster management has not been given its due in the school curriculum of Kerala. and for that matter, even in other Indian states. Some institutions have a separate book on the subject for middle and high school kids, for example, but rarely does it get the treatment a subject like math or science does. Most importantly, it is not graded, making it less significant for a student focused on scoring well in exams. Graded subjects such as science and social science do have some information on disasters such as earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, fires, but there is little practical knowledge about dealing with them. Some schools also have extracurricular activities such as clubs, board games, card games, science projects on environment, which are definitely not enough. This solution was proposed by UNICEF to Kerala's education department. To prevent future disasters, let's train the kids. The aim was to sensitize teachers, children, and their parents at a time when everybody was receptive, with the biggest disaster they ever witnessed just behind them. The process was to creatively add new information to the existing lessons in textbooks. 4 focus points were chosen: disaster risk reduction, the life skills needed for it, empathy, and psychosocial care for those who suffered trauma. It was done by integrating a good mix of leading information, extra boxes, images, follow up questions, activities, and links to lessons in a manner that it did not affect their continuity. 50 teachers were called upon for the task. They brainstormed and attended workshops by experts to create additional material. So it wasn't just knowledge, they put together their own experience of disasters to prepare the new curriculum. For example, in a grade 5 Hindi language book, there's a story about a young boy whose boat topples after banging against a rock. He cannot swim and he cries out for help. Then a passerby notices him and saves his life. So, related to this, new questions were added at the end of the lesson for reflection, such as, why did the passerby save the boy? Why should you learn to swim? In which situations would you get a chance to help others? These questions were added as they are likely to evoke empathy and emphasize the importance of swimming as a life skill in 10-year-old children. In another story, the anecdote of a blanket seller has been tied in. Now, this man donated his entire stock to flood survivors. Reading it, kids are expected to understand the concept of civic consciousness by reflecting why the man donates everything, knowing that it was his only source of income for months to come. Then there were real life stories of kids who have used their school education to rise up to situations like recognizing signs of a tsunami or saving other children from choking from fire. This was done to give the students a feel of what it is to be leaders and not merely recipients of knowledge. Physical education includes drills on using fire extinguishers, managing gas leaks, road accidents, riots, and other things. Stamina building activities such as trekking, tree climbing, and swimming were also added to physical education because they are important life skills. Then for students to understand that stress could be an aftermath of a disaster, psychosocial care was built into language lessons. This was to enable them to read its signs in their friends and relatives and support them to seek help. Finally, teachers were trained to deliver these lessons and add in the specific ecological vulnerabilities of their region for students. While the solution is replicable in schools across India and globally, there are limitations to measuring its large-scale impact. In the past few weeks, I reached out to a few teachers to check how the new curriculum, now running in its second year, panned out for them. Many confirmed that it helped them simplify facts about the environment, disasters, and climate change for students. One of them told me that the students are now aware of the human intervention that caused the recent floods and are trying to make the elders aware of it. One teacher discussed planting native trees on hill slopes in her classroom to prevent landslides. And yet another one mentioned that his school has dedicated one period every fortnight to open discussions on climate change and disasters. All in all, the solution was unique because it was implemented at the right time, at a large scale, by the state and not an NGO, meaning all children in the state are covered. It was made relevant by including not only aspects of disaster risk reduction, but also life skills, empathy, and psychosocial care. Everything was integrated seamlessly into the existing lessons and reinforced through different subjects. And lastly, teachers were trained by experts to deliver knowledge and add their own experience to the lessons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priti. As you can see, I hope, or hear, this is a story that just really is so, just says so much about how we bring solutions journalism and its practice and process to the work that we can do in climate. As Priti said, she started working on the story not long after this enormous storm, it hits Kerala. And usually what we would do is the problem story, the disaster story. And Priti, I just think it was great that you saw a story that was about solutions and also really about children and resilience and teaching them also about natural disasters and about what's happening in their world. So thank you so much. I put the link to the story into the chat box. And now I'm going to turn over, and we'll take questions at the end as well if anyone has questions. I'm going to turn over the time to Julia. Take us on your journey, Julia.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here today with everyone. As Fara just mentioned, so I was a lead fellow with Solutions Journalism Network in 2019-2020. And so our project started because as a science communicator as well, I felt that there wasn't much stories of solutions around the climate crisis. And as Farah mentioned just before, I felt it was all about, the crisis and what's happening and disaster, but not really about the solutions. And so when we started on the project with INKLINE, the idea for us was really that we wanted to showcase solutions that are working in different parts of the world so that we would give people an overview of what are different practices that we can learn from. And so what we did thanks to the fellowship is we basically commissioned stories from 6 different continents. So what we did is we put it on the website saying, okay, we're looking for stories of solutions relating to the climate crisis. Please reach out to us and let us know which continent you feel like you belong to. And we wanted people who were really on the ground already and embedded within the community so that they knew really in depth what was working or not in different parts of the world. And so we ended up with 6 different stories that are now all published on our website. And I'm going to share with you today a bit of the insights that we gained working on these different stories. So before doing that, I just wanted to give you like a very, very quick summary of these 6 stories. So we had a story from Mexico about climate change induced inundation and looking at how the community is responding in Mexico City and how they are working together to both educate local communities, but also working together to make sure that they can mitigate the risk from these inundations. Then we had a story from Australia about Indigenous knowledge and looking at the seasonal and ecological knowledge that some of the Indigenous groups have in one part of Australia and looking at what we can learn from it. We also had a story from Mali looking at women empowerment and alternative to charcoal. We then had a story from Indonesia about pitland, which is an ecosystem that doesn't really get covered very often. So that was quite an interesting one. We also had then someone who looked at, in Czech Republic, how cryptocurrency can help boost agriculture, which was something that we definitely had never heard before. So that was quite a fascinating one. And then we had someone from Chile who looked at the Mapuche community and how they are using sustainable agriculture. And so for us, one thing that was really interesting throughout these 6 different stories is that we kind of started seeing themes emerge, and as well through other stories that were pitched to us and that potentially were not selected. So we kind of saw a dichotomy in terms of the way people went about covering solutions when it came to the climate crisis. And what we saw is that we very much had one group of people who were pitching us innovation and tech as a potential solution. And so the stories from Czech Republic about cryptocurrency was a perfect example of that. You know, looking at very new technology, how you can actually use it to benefit the environment instead of having this bad reputation that cryptocurrency is really bad. And so that's something that we saw in different stories. And that's something that, again, we picked up in Mali as well, with the innovation for the alternative to charcoal and how people are cooking with different technique to make it better for the environment. But then we also had at the same time an opposite reaction and lots of different stories being pitched to us that were about the contrary, basically looking at the past and what we can learn from traditional practices and local communities that have been doing things in a certain way for a very long time. And so that's what we really picked up on in our story from Chile, for example, with looking at sustainable agriculture, and then again with the story in Australia, looking at the indigenous practices and how it's all tied together with like the seasons and the management of fires, and that's things that it's quite interesting to get back into, because I feel we often feel that technology and innovation is the way forward, but actually there is quite a push as well to look at what we used to do and to learn from that and make sure that we work with these communities who have this traditional knowledge as well. Another thing that I think really resonated throughout these 6 pieces that we ended up publishing was the importance of empathy. And what we thought worked really well in terms of the solution stories that we published was really the fact that the communities were at the heart of the story. And so we noticed that particularly with the story in Mexico, it was really about how communities can learn from what's happening with these new floods and inundation that happen more often now because of the climate crisis, and really building up from that. And for us, it was really important that we had journalists who were actually from these regions, so that they were embedded within these communities and could really get them to pass on their voices as well in their piece. And we didn't want, someone who was in a completely different country, for example, to write about something. The immersion for us was really important. And I think we really saw that them in the way that people have threaded empathy and like the power of communities throughout these 6 stories was really quite interesting to see. And somehow that relates as well to the power of storytelling. And I think what we've noticed with all these different journalists that we worked on is what made their stories quite compelling to us as well from the start was the strong storytelling aspect that they brought in. Often the climate crisis or covering the environment can be seen as maybe a bit of a dry topic where you have to look into the research and try to understand all these different facts. But by bringing human stories to the forefront, either being it by highlighting specific communities or just by picking their interviewees, they created really strong narratives, and we felt that it was a really powerful way to bring all those solutions as well about the climate crisis to the forefront. And so for us, that was a really interesting process, just looking through all these different stories. And we're definitely keen on doing more climate coverage because it's the stories were received really, really well. And it's been really impressive seeing what people thought about each of these stories and how they resonated with different people, or even seeing how a story from Mexico can then somehow make sense in the Philippines. And the scalability of all these different stories was also something that we really insisted on when we started the project. It's like we didn't want something that was so local that it wouldn't resonate with other people, or nobody would be able to learn from the lessons shared in the story. And I think our 6 journalists did a brilliant job at making sure that their stories are very scalable, and that even if you're not from that region, you can read it and be like, oh, okay, I see how I could adapt this to my own country or to my own context. And that's what made them particularly powerful, I think.
Great, thank you so much, Julia. Right now, we don't have any questions in the Q&A, so I'm gonna encourage people to please put questions up into the Q&A box. But I'd love to call out a couple of things that I heard that I think are so important in the work we do with Solutions Journalism Network. is really thinking about it as a response to a real world problem, a response that's happening right now, a solutions that's happening right now. I think a lot of climate change coverage can often be very future looking. It can either be of the moment, sort of the apocalyptic, this is happening right now, like the storms that hit Kerala, or it can be sort of future. How are we going to save our planet? And what I love about solutions journalism is we're really focused in the now and what are the solutions right now. And then evidence. Both of you showed great evidence in how the response is working, but also limitations. And I love, Priti, that you went back to people in the past couple of weeks to just see how things are going. It's a really important process for us. And then I think, Julia, for you, impact of these stories and your focus on making sure that the efforts aren't so localized that they couldn't exist in other places or exist in other communities. We have a question that's in the chat. Here's a question. I'd love to hear examples of how you change journalist mindsets, getting them to reframe their approach from just the reactive and what we sometimes call destruction porn that is focused on the disaster alone, and instead getting them to lead with signs of solutions. Julia, I'm going to throw that to you because you actually took in story ideas. How do we get at changing the journalist mindset?
So I think for us, what worked really well is that this project was advertised from the start as part of the fellowship with Solutions Journalism Network. So we had that clear label of what we want are solution stories. And I think that really helped people starting to think about how they wanted to pitch and the focus of their stories. Because what we did when we promoted and starting putting the call for pitches is we created like little graphic on social media with the key points of what a solution story should contain. And we felt that that really helped people being like, okay, if I want to pitch for INKLINE, then we need to tick all these boxes. And so then we had these pitches that were really solutions focused, just because from the start we had made it clear that that's what we were looking for. And I think what we did as well after that is we asked all the journalists who took part in this project to be trained. So online, Solutions Journalism Network has these regular trainings that are fantastic. And we asked all our journalists to make sure that they did the training before sending us their final stories. So I think that was quite a really helpful way to frame it for the journalists to then know exactly what we were looking for.
Great, thank you, Julia. Priti, I'll ask you the same question. You could have gone into the situation that you were in with this horrible storm and the aftermaths, and done the typical story. What was going on in your mind of how you wanted to tell the story differently or looking differently at it? You're on mute, Priti.
So the first problem was that I was not in Kerala at that point of time. I live miles away, and I wanted to report a story. Being a solutions journalist, I'm always looking for solutions, which I did even during COVID. And this idea actually was very unique because this kind of a step has never been taken in India. And even when I reached out to UNICEF, they told me that they haven't done it with any other state. So this was very, very unique. And in my past life, I have been an educator. I have taught children for a few years. And I know what it is, how important it is to get these things through the curriculum rather than through extracurricular activities, because children don't take it seriously. So I think that was what really clicked, and I thought it was a very important solution when the whole state was thinking of other things, of relief measures, of course, which were very important. But I mean, the education department actually came forward to with this solution. I think it was amazing.
Great, thank you, Priti and Julia. So we have a really great question from Molly. Apologies, I also had a coughing attack there for a minute. This happens even in virtual settings. So question from Molly Cruz. Do you find it more difficult to find solution stories than problem ones? And can you tell us how you go about discovering these solution stories? Julia, do you want to start, and then we'll jump to Priti?
Yes, so I feel for this one, I actually have an advantage somehow because so INKLINE is a passion project that I do on the side, but my full-time job is in the environmental sector. And I work for an organization that is all about finding the positive stories about the environment. So I have to say, I do have like a stock of stories from my job, which is quite useful. If you're ever looking for positive stories on the environment, you can check conservation optimism. But I think in general, I don't think there are more solution stories or problem stories. I think it's really about shifting the mindset, because I feel when you start looking for solutions, you start seeing them everywhere, because people are trying all around the world to make a difference for their communities or just to make things better. And I feel often it's just that frame of mind where we're like, okay, we need to find a problem and then report on that. Once you start shifting it, I feel lots of stories just appear. And also, once you start reporting on it, I feel you get more people contacting you and sending you these stories. So I think it's kind of like a nice loop. Once we're in it, and it's easy, it gets easier to then find these stories.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Priti.
Yeah, for me too, just as Julia said, when you start looking for solutions, you start finding them as well. And I get them from all my sources, like social media handles, from podcasts, from even other stories, other journalist stories who could be reporting on the same problem in their countries. And what I do is I just try to visualize that kind of a solution in my country, and then try to find it and see if, if somebody has thought about it, or if a similar thing has been taken up by an organization. And in a lot of cases I'm able to find a solution in that way. So yeah, so I do look for solutions everywhere.
Yeah, I think both of you point to this mindset change of instead of looking for problems, looking for solutions. I've put into the chat box, one of the ways that I think about it as well is when I'm going into what I think is sort of a problem area. Let's say I searched through our story tracker, the Solutions Journalism Story Tracker, which now has over 10,000 stories. So in there, you could actually start to think, oh, that's an interesting story. Maybe, as Priti said, maybe I could see if that's happening in my state or in my country. The other thing that both of you mentioned that I want to call out in both of your discussions was empathy and community. And I think when we start to think about community, instead of sort of this world, this like apocalyptic nature that I think we can get to, and I think one of the questions used the phrase destruction porn, is we get ourselves into that space of, it's unsolvable, it's apocalyptic. But we know that the climate crisis, to a great extent, is human made, and therefore it is human solved. And so if we start thinking in that way, in thinking around community and thinking about what does this community need, what are they looking at, what problems are they facing, and what solutions are they bringing. And I think this idea of empathy and resilience is a really great place as well to start. And we often don't move into that space until after we've done all of the problem stories. Any last, we're almost at time, any last comments? And I'm going to just check the Q&A box. There's a question from Lucy Serna. How do you, and we'll answer this quickly, how do you scrutinize the potential solution for your story before you decide to do the reporting on that particular response? How do you make sure it's really working and has real impact with solid evidence-based story? So a little bit on process. So quickly, Priti, for 30 seconds.
Okay. So one of the things that I try to do is I reach out to at least two people who know about that, who could potentially know about this solution, and then check with them. Once I get some kind of an endorsement, I move ahead with the story, because sometimes, especially with remote reporting, it may not be possible to really judge whether that solution is working or not. So I try to do that. I just find more evidence of impact before I start reporting. For me, my process is to actually do at least half of the reporting before I pitch the story, and then then I'm left with very little work after the story is assigned. Yeah, so I follow that.
Julia.
Yeah, I think as well, one thing that I remember seeing multiple times at the Solutions Journalism Network training is the fact that a solutions can't just be like a prototype. So you need to just make sure that that solution is actually implemented and it's not just an idea. And I think sometimes you get people, trying to convince you to write a story about something that sounds really good, but then you realize that actually there's no data at all, or it hasn't really properly started. So I would say for us, that's always the starting point, just making sure that there's some kind of data or numbers on the impact of the solutions that we're reporting on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are now at the end of this session. I want to thank Priti and Julia for joining us. And thank you so much. And you can, we'll be sending more links throughout this sort of module on climate, but you can also connect with them on the LinkedIn group for the Prague Media Point. So thank you so much. Thanks for your wisdom and your words this morning or this afternoon. Thank you.